For the pilots in WW2, the difference between life and death often was the simple plane they were given. Today, we're going to rank every major aircraft of World War II, from the ones that got men killed to the one that made a country win a world war and changed warfare forever.
10. The worst. Blackburn Botha, UK. Picture this. It's 1939. Britain is staring down the barrel of a world war. The Royal Air Force needs a torpedo bomber, something fast, lethal, capable of hunting submarines across the North Sea. What they got was the Blackburn Botha. On paper, it looked fine. 2 engines, room for a crew of 4. It was supposed to be a patrol bomber that could do everything. And that right there, do everything, is where the story starts to go wrong. The Botha was underpowered from the moment it rolled off the line. Its 2 Bristol Perseus engines struggled so badly that the aircraft could barely maintain altitude with a full crew on board. Pilots reported that if one engine failed, and they did fail, you weren't gliding to safety. You were falling. The defensive armament was laughable. The turret gun had such a restricted field of fire that enemy fighters could attack from angles the gunners simply could not reach. It was like putting a lock on a door and leaving the window wide open. Here's the number that tells you everything. The Botha was withdrawn from frontline operations within months of entering service. Not years, months. It was quietly shuffled off to training duties, which tragically is where it killed the most people. Accidents during training were frequent enough that crews reportedly dreaded being assigned to it. The Botha wasn't a war machine. It was a liability with wings.
9. Brewster Buffalo, USA. Now, here's a plane that looked like the future and became a symbol of everything that can go wrong when a good idea meets a changing world. The Brewster Buffalo was actually America's first monoplane carrier fighter. In 1939, when it entered service, it was competitive, reasonably fast, reasonably armed. The Finnish Air Force flew it against the Soviets and loved it, using the Buffalo to rack up kill ratios that defied belief. But the Pacific theater was a different world entirely. When American and British pilots flew the Buffalo against Japanese Zeros over Malaya and the Dutch East Indies in 1941 and 42, the results were catastrophic. The Zero was lighter, faster, and turned tighter than anything the Allied pilots had trained to fight. The Buffalo, meanwhile, had been loaded up with extra armor, radios, and equipment, all of which made it slower and heavier than its specs promised. British pilots flying Buffaloes in the defense of Singapore described it as being trapped in a slow, stubborn box while Zeros danced around them. One RAF report didn't mince words, calling it totally inadequate for combat. The men flying these machines weren't inferior pilots. They were brave, trained, and experienced. They were just handed the wrong tool for the job, and in aerial combat, there's very little margin for that mistake. The Buffalo story isn't really about a bad plane. It's about the brutal speed at which warfare evolves, and what happens to the men caught in the gap between yesterday's technology and today's enemy. 8. Fairey Swordfish, UK. Here's where the list gets interesting, because the next aircraft looks, on every measurable level, like it should be closer to the bottom. The Fairey Swordfish was a biplane in World War II. It had a top speed of around 138 miles per hour. To put that in perspective, by 1940, most fighter planes were doing over 350. It was open cockpit, fabric covered. It looked like something out of the First World War. And yet, the Swordfish outlasted nearly every aircraft it flew alongside. On the night of November 11, 1940, 21 Swordfish took off from HMS Illustrious and attacked the Italian fleet at Taranto Harbor. Flying through anti-aircraft fire in the dark, dropping torpedoes at mast height, they crippled 3 Italian battleships in a single night. Half the Italian battle fleet neutralized with 21 biplanes. That attack, by the way, was studied intensely by Japanese naval planners. It helped inspire Pearl Harbor. The Swordfish also hunted and helped sink the Bismarck. Its torpedo hits jammed the German battleship's rudder, sealing its fate. Why did this ancient-looking aircraft survive while faster, modern planes were retired? Partly because it was so slow that radar-fused anti-aircraft shells sometimes couldn't arm in time before it passed. Partly because it was rugged, forgiving, and could operate in conditions that grounded more sophisticated aircraft. The Swordfish is proof that on the list of things that matter in war, ingenuity, bravery, and being used correctly sometimes outrank raw speed and power. 7. Junkers Ju-87 Stuka, Germany. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine this sound.
The Junkers Ju-87 Stuka had sirens attached to its fixed landing gear, called Jericho trumpets. When it dove, those sirens screamed. It wasn't an accident, it was engineered. The Stuka was designed not just to destroy, but to terrify. And in the early years of the war, it worked brilliantly. Over Poland in 1939, over France in 1940, the Stuka was the sharp tip of Germany's Blitzkrieg, the lightning war. It flew ahead of the tanks, obliterating artillery positions, bridges, troop columns. It was so precise for its era that it was essentially flying artillery. Wehrmacht commanders loved it. But the Stuka had a critical flaw baked into its very design. It was slow. Very slow for a warplane, around 240 miles per hour in level flight. And those fixed, non-retractable landing gear created enormous drag. When Germany turned its attention to Britain in 1940, the Stuka flew into a completely different fight. RAF Spitfires and Hurricanes were waiting. In just 4 days of combat over the English Channel and South England, the Luftwaffe lost so many Stukas that the type was withdrawn from the Battle of Britain entirely. The Stuka story is the story of a weapon that was perfectly designed for one kind of war and desperately exposed in another. It was a terror weapon that only worked when nobody was there to stop it. When someone was, it fell out of the sky.
6. Mitsubishi A6M Zero, Japan. When the Zero first appeared in combat over China in 1940, Allied intelligence officers refused to believe the reports. A Japanese fighter outmaneuvering, outrunning, and outclimbing everything in the sky? It had to be a mistake. Western assumptions about Japanese manufacturing ran deep, and those assumptions were dead wrong. The Zero was extraordinary. It had an operational range of over 1,500 miles, almost double what American fighters could manage. It could outturn virtually anything it encountered. Its two 20mm cannons hit with devastating force. In the hands of Japan's veteran pilots, men who had been flying and fighting since the mid-1930s, it was genuinely the most feared fighter in the Pacific. Pearl Harbor, Wake Island, the fall of the Philippines, for the first 6 months after December 1941, the Zero owned the Pacific sky. But Jiro Horikoshi, the engineer who designed it, had made a choice that would eventually doom his masterpiece. To achieve that incredible range and agility, he stripped out weight ruthlessly. No armor plating for the pilot, no self-sealing fuel tanks. The Zero was a thoroughbred built on a razor's edge. Once American pilots learned to never turn fight a Zero, to use hit-and-run tactics, to dive away from trouble rather than engage in a turning duel, the calculus changed. And as the war ground on, Japan's veteran pilots were killed and not replaced. Newer pilots in the same plane simply couldn't perform the same miracles. By 1944, the Zero was being used as a kamikaze delivery vehicle. It rose higher than almost anyone imagined, and fell further.
5. Curtiss P-40 Warhawk, USA. Nobody ever called the P-40 the best fighter of the war. Nobody wrote poems about it. It wasn't the fastest. It wasn't the most elegant. But if you want to understand what actually won World War II, not the glamour, but the grind, you need to understand the P-40 Warhawk. It was tough, brutally, almost stubbornly tough. Where the Zero sacrificed protection for performance, the P-40 was the opposite. Pilots took hits that would have turned other planes into fireballs and nursed their Warhawks home. It was also available. The P-40 was in production and ready for export when the war began in ways that more advanced designs weren't. Britain flew it, Australia flew it, the Soviet Union flew it, thousands of them on the brutal Eastern Front. And then there was the Flying Tigers. Claire Chennault's American volunteer group flew shark-mouth P-40s over China before America even formally entered the war. Fighting against the Zero, that mythological killer, Chennault devised tactics that played to the P-40's strengths. Diving attacks, hit and run, never turning, always converting speed into altitude and back again. His pilots achieved kill ratios that stunned the world. The P-40 deserves its place in this list not for being extraordinary, but for being exactly what was needed, exactly when it was needed, and reliable enough to be flown by men who were still learning what survival looked like. In war, showing up matters. The P-40 always showed up.
4. Focke-Wulf Fw, Germany. September 1941. A Royal Air Force pilot climbs out of his cockpit over southern England, shaken. He's just encountered something new, something that rolled faster than anything he'd seen, something that dove away from combat before he could react. When the reports reached RAF High Command, there was genuine alarm. The Spitfire, Britain's prized fighter, the hero of the Battle of Britain, had just met something that, in several key respects, beat it. The Focke-Wulf Fw shocked the Allies. Designer Kurt Tank had built it around a powerful BMW radial engine, an unconventional choice when liquid-cooled inline engines were fashionable, and the result was a fighter of startling capability. Its roll rate was exceptional, meaning a skilled Fw pilot could flip into a diving escape faster than a pursuer could follow. Its armament, eventually 4 cannons and 2 machine guns, was lethal. For nearly a year, the Fw held a genuine edge over Allied fighters on the Western Front. It was the primary reason the RAF suffered badly in 1941 and early 1942 trying to take the fight over occupied France. It also evolved constantly, into a ground attack variant, into a long-range fighter, into a high-altitude interceptor. The Fw never quite lost its menace until the very end of the war, and only the arrival of newer Allied designs denied it air supremacy it might otherwise have held. It was, by any honest measure, one of the finest piston engine fighters ever built.
3. Supermarine Spitfire, UK. There are aircraft that win wars, and then there are aircraft that mean something. The Supermarine Spitfire is both. Reginald Mitchell designed the Spitfire in the mid-1930s, and he didn't live to see what it became. He died of cancer in 1937. But the elliptical wings he drew, the sleek nose, the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, they produced something that was, from its first flight, beautiful in a way that purely functional machines rarely are. In the summer of 1940, during the Battle of Britain, the Spitfire and the Hurricane together stopped the Luftwaffe from achieving air superiority over England. What made the Spitfire exceptional wasn't any single thing, it was the combination. Speed, climb rate, maneuverability, and a quality the pilots described as responsiveness, as if the aircraft could read your intentions before your hands completed the input. And it kept improving. The Spitfire went through 24 major variants over the course of the war. Each generation faster, better armed, higher flying than the last. It was still in frontline service when the war ended, still competitive, which almost no other aircraft from 1940 could claim. Pilots who flew the Spitfire, including enemy pilots who faced it, described it the same way, like nothing else. That isn't sentiment, that's the record.
2. North American P-51 Mustang, USA. By 1943, the Allied bombing campaign over Germany was in crisis. American B-17 Flying Fortresses were flying deep into the Reich in daylight, hitting factories, rail yards, oil refineries. It was strategically essential. It was also costing catastrophic numbers of lives. On one single mission to Schweinfurt in October 1943, the 8th Air Force lost 60 bombers, 600 men, in one afternoon. The bombers flew the last leg alone, and the Luftwaffe was waiting. Then came the P-51 Mustang. It had an interesting origin. Designed by North American Aviation in 1940 to a British specification, it was initially underpowered and mediocre. Then an RAF engineer suggested pairing the airframe with the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine. The combination was transformational. The Mustang with a Merlin engine could escort bombers all the way to Berlin and back, over 1,600-mile round trips, at altitude, fast enough to engage anything the Luftwaffe could scramble, tough enough to absorb punishment. And, crucially, there were thousands of them. When Mustangs began arriving over Germany in early 1944, Luftwaffe pilots felt it immediately. The long-range escort that wasn't supposed to exist had arrived. Skilled German pilots who had been bleeding the bombers were now being hunted far from home, and the balance shifted. General Adolf Galland, one of Germany's greatest fighter aces, testified after the war that the moment he knew Germany would lose the air war was when he first saw P-51s over Berlin. One airplane, one engineering decision, the course of the war.
1. The best. Messerschmitt Me 262, Germany, #1. Not because it won. It didn't. Not because it saved its country. It couldn't. The Messerschmitt Me 262 sits at the top of this list because it was, technologically, an aircraft that didn't belong in its era. It was a jet fighter, the world's first operational jet fighter, arriving in the middle of a war being fought by propeller-driven planes. Its 2 Junkers JMO turbojets pushed it to 560 miles per hour. That's 100 miles per hour faster than the P-51 Mustang. It climbed faster. It carried 4 30mm cannons that could tear a bomber apart in seconds. Allied pilots who encountered it described the experience in terms of shock, as if a machine from the future had suddenly appeared in their gun sights. And it had.
The Me-262 should have been in the skies by 1942. The prototypes were ready. But a combination of factors, developmental delays, manufacturing problems, Hitler's insistence at one stage that it be used as a bomber rather than a fighter, meant it didn't enter serious combat operations until late 1944. By then, Germany was already losing the war on every front. Even so, Me-262 pilots achieved a kill ratio that defied the odds. Small units of these jets disrupted Allied air operations in ways that far greater numbers of conventional aircraft could not. What the Me-262 really represents is a glimpse through a doorway. The door to the future of aviation, the jet age, the supersonic age, the world every commercial passenger on every flight today still lives in. It was conceived in war, born too late to change the outcome of that war, and yet it changed everything that came after. The best aircraft of World War II, and the beginning of a world the men who flew it never quite lived to see fully arrive.
If you liked this video, I'm sure you'll like this one too. Subscribe if you enjoyed this video. Our channel is small, so we are replying every comment below. Comment any suggestion for future videos. Thanks for watching.